the first of many sessions for the revived HCI research group. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Arthi Manohar, who is a lecturer in the design school and is also a very new member for the HCI research group, and is also really well known in the HCI community.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, Mark, for organising this. Hello, everyone. I was just telling Monica that this is my first in-person lecture. Well, I have lectured for students, but for academics, perhaps probably the first in-person lecture. So I'm a little bit nervous. Hopefully the contents make sense. Thankfully, there's less people in person, so that helps. I mean, it's nice to have a HCI group in Brunel. I do appreciate all the effort Monica has put in organising this. I hope this continues and interesting conversations and discussions happen in this place. I'm also aware I'm from a design background, speaking to a computer science group here. So do feel free to interrupt me and have any questions that I'm going to be presenting on. So I've basically picked a handful of students' work, including some kind of food for thought in terms of how can design be used as an inquiry in HCI. I mean, there's some PhD students here, so just for their benefit, I just wanted to say that HCI is quite a multidisciplinary area, if I understand. If you know, I don't know if you've looked at some of the HCI works before. So if you look at HCI conferences, like Monica is just back from CHI, which is like one of the biggest HCI conferences, you get computer scientists, designers, anthropologists, social scientists, you know, so all people from all kinds of disciplines trying to sort of work around HCI area. So being in a design department, so I get the opportunity to work with students who have some very interesting, very complex projects that sometimes tackles the socio-technical issues, sometimes ethical issues in the society. And in a way, I don't think they're quite realize they're in HCI, but they kind of approach it from a design perspective. But as a supervisor, so I sort of feed in some theory and practice within that space. So I want to share how design, in a way, unconsciously in some of these projects, used as an inquiry rather than looking at as a solution. In the most traditional sense, design is always looked at as a solution and trying to fix a problem, if you know what I mean. So a little bit of background. I think Monica was very generous in saying that, but I'm very much of an early career researcher. I have a background in architecture, and you know, there's some interdisciplinary people in the room as well, and on teams. A background in architecture, I went on to do a PhD in product design from the University of Dundee socio-digital group. It is a little bit relevant here because architecture, when I was studying undergrad, it was kind of taught and instilled as mostly as one person as a designer. You're designing everything. You're designing the aesthetics, you're designing the plan, you're designing the interiors. Whereas once you kind of move away from that idea of design as a lonely process, and then when you come back to see the actual work, design is always a very collaborative space. You know, you never really do design on your own. It's always with somebody, whether it's being a computer scientist who's helping you actualize what you're designing, whether being an engineer or even a material scientist actually trying to manufacture what concepts you're trying to bring. So in a way, that was such a big cultural shift in what I was taught for about 5 years in architecture school, as opposed to what I did in practice, what I did as a postdoc, what I did as a PhD, where it's such a multidisciplinary team that you end up working. And I try to sort of bring that within some of the projects that I do with students as well. So after kind of towards the end of the PhD, I had an opportunity to work as a visiting fellow at University of Nottingham, which is a computer science department, but again, quite interdisciplinary. I was working in the mixed reality lab, which they do some really interesting AR/VR projects, if you're keen to look up. what they do. And my second work experience was in Glasgow School of Art for an AHRC project where co-design was followed as a design approach in order to engage with the local communities to make sense of how can we create a more democratic space to engage with your public citizens. And so the decisions that you make for the community is not necessarily a top-down approach, but rather a bottom-up approach. How do you do that through design? And after that, I did a postdoc or research fellow position in Northumbria University Newcastle. I was working on an EPSRC project looking at design as a way to understand blockchain and artificial intelligence. So that's kind of where I know, kind of diving back to HCI in a way. From my PhD, moving away from HCI and going back to HCI, it really gave me a perspective to see how design can be actually used in HCI as a way of discourse, as a way of inquiry, as a way to promote discussions across interdisciplinarity, and also applying sort of interesting creative methods within, again, complex socio-technical projects. I'm sorry if it's too obvious for some people. Please do let me know if you have any questions. Happy to really clarify how some of these methods are used, how approaches are used as well. And now I'm a lecturer in Brunel. It's been about 3 years. Seems like time flies by. And I'm teaching masters and undergrad. Interaction design and user experience is quite an interesting module to teach in a slightly sort of traditional product design department where they look at kind of physical products. So looking at UX UI has been really, really interesting with the students in the last year or so. And hopefully in the next maybe coming talks, if I have more opportunity, happy to talk a little bit about some of the research and findings within that area as part of the HCI talk. So I have a few projects ongoing. Actually, one of the projects is with another HCI member, TOTeM, who's a computer science person. So we have an EPSRC project called 3Ds, like Trust in Homes and Free Thinking Interfaces. So hopefully we were just having lunch before and we were saying perhaps in the coming lectures, if possible, maybe we can put our findings together and present. So it's a really interesting project looking at privacy within smart home devices, and we are looking at some various use cases, and we ran multiple workshops over the lockdown with lots of challenges, and at the moment we're in the process of getting a chapter published for Human Data Interaction Network. So we hopefully will have some interesting insights to share in the future. I'm very keen, sort of, again, using design approaches in HCI in order to try and understand sort of complex problems within the area. So hence I've, this is also trying to show how some of my teaching and research are quite sort of intertwined and integrated as well, how they inform each other. So lots of the UX UI project I work very much sort of is informed in a way, also informed by the research projects which I work on based on the human-computer interaction, HCI topics and human data interaction field as well. So I've published a little bit on some of these areas in the past. While some of my work started in blockchain and cryptocurrencies and online, how transaction is viewed within online, but I kind of moved on from there at this point and look at more IoT. Some of PhD students are looking at augmented reality. Liz is another student of mine who's sitting a corner over there. So he's looking at inclusive design within visually impaired. So hopefully I thought it's another way to kind of tie in HCI research as well. So perhaps Liz will be able to present his findings at some point as part of the research group here. Good motivation for us to start collecting data now. So a few areas within the emerging technology interest I'm interested to explore as part of the research I'm exploring currently, and perhaps also in the future looking for sort of fundings to take some of the design works forward across some of these emerging technology fields. And I think what kind of ties these together, for me at least, is role can the designers play within this area? And a lot of some of the publications around these are mostly about making these discussions, how do we make these discussions more meaningful to each other, in the sense how sometimes it's not about the language, we all speak the same language, but sometimes the terminologies we use and what we mean by these terminologies will differ so much across these disciplines. And how can design actually make them meaningful and discursive across these disciplines is what I'm very interested in, and something that I try and experiment and iterate as I go as well. With students' work, with my own research work, because it's easy to fall within the traditional way of thinking and sort of learning. But how do we kind of push our boundaries to try and sort of do something new, which is, use creative practices? And so there's lots of examples and inspirations you can take from. So, I look for like design informatics in Edinburgh, so they do some very fantastic work in, like block exchange, like using Lego blocks to understand how transaction in blockchain works, for example. And so a few sort of inspirations in terms of how creative methods are actually used within HCI to understand complex technology. So but that's the kind of underlying message. And one of the kind of main things I try to follow is research through design, and there is always a conversation about theory versus practice when it comes to students' work, and sometimes it also applies to our own projects as well. Where does the theory stop and where does the practice start? And it's always sort of a tension in terms of when you're designing something, when you are exploring a new topic. Research is very, very important, and that's something that especially as students, sometimes they try to grapple with when is the right time to start research, or when do you say this is enough research and you want to do your actual design. And it's really kind of a very subjective thing, and sometimes the design and research could actually sit hand in hand. So they can actually go along parallelly sometimes, or perhaps they can take stages. Sometimes it's quite iterative. A lot of the times I ask my students to go back to a research even after when they think the design is complete. I was like, can you go back and look at the research and see if there's anything that you want to add, change, justify even. So because let's say, for example, even if it's a UX UI design that you're doing, you're including a particular design feature as part of this, a part of this design. How are you able to justify it? And research is the only way you are able to justify some of the decisions that you're making. And sometimes the users are there in order to just help you justify those decisions you're making. So research through design is a big part of what some of the projects are based, especially with students. So I have chosen like a handful of examples across undergrad and master's students. Some of them, they've been working over a year, so some of them are a little more interesting to look at how it's shaped. Some of them are a bit more shorter, maybe 4 months time, so it's not necessarily a big time to delve into research and make sense of it, but it's still quite interesting, as I said, sort of topics to see how design is used as an inquiry. So some of the approaches I want to highlight in some of in these examples is how creative methods are used as in order to use design as an inquiry, and also different approaches like human-centered design, user-centered design, and co-design and inclusive design as well. So there's a few ways students have looked at different design approaches and how they have incorporated in the particular topic, and not all approaches are in this, there is a way of justifying why a certain approaches would work better than the other. So user-centered design is something that you would particularly apply to a user with a user in mind. Whereas if you think about human-centered design, it's much more of a societal issue. So you're looking at a slightly more kind of complex network in sort of understanding the problem and sort of solving the problem as well. Whereas co-design, you're looking at more of wider stakeholder engagement into the design process. So your insights and design and iterations and kind of technology buildings are all very much sort of involved with what the user wants, what the user says, and kind of, you know, going back to do usability and evaluation testing as well. So design as an inquiry in HCI. So what does it mean? So traditionally design is looked at as a problem solver. So there is a problem in the society, and how do we actually try and fix it? So this is an image from Design Council. So so obviously there is a problem, and there comes a designer trying to understand what the problem is. And there you go, this is the fix. But we have kind of moved away a little bit in the last few years, and we are looking at design as an inquiry more than that, more than just a problem fixer. So sometimes design creates more problems than solutions. I think HCI is very much aware of some of these problems we have created ourselves. So how do we actually try to understand the problems in a much more meaningful way, and how do we try and fix it? So sometimes it's a holistic view we need to have. So what kind of policies do we have in order to address these issues? You know, who are the stakeholders? Sometimes it's not just one set of groups, but there are multiple sets of groups. And some of the examples I'm going to show really kind of talks about how these sort of wider citizens are taken into account, and then maybe try and understand how do we actually propose a solution. And solution not necessarily comes as a single product anymore, it comes as a service these days. So if there is a problem, if there is a solution and there could be a problem, and how do we actually try and address that, and what kind of problems do we actually foresee, so that there is a service and system built around it in order to do that. Sorry if it sounds too much like a lecture rather than a talk. So design for me is a means of an inquiry and exploration of the nuances of human behavior and experience. And it's not necessarily a mere means to an end, so definitely not an end. It's more of a start of something new, and see it as an iterative process, not as a mere end of anything. So maybe I'll be very picky in what I'm going to talk about in terms of the examples. So this is actually a very interesting project that we did with the master's students called Bridging Digital Divide. So this was an RSA brief that was a couple of years ago. How do we, so there's lots of issues social media has brought us in the recent years, as you might know, right from democracy to you know, fake news to anti-vaxxers. There's no doubt there's more coming in the future. So how do we actually address this polarization that the social media has created? So there was quite an open brief, quite a complex brief as well, and giving it to a product designer. So how do we actually do that? So this particular student, Jim, has actually taken more like a user-centered approach to this. So especially like in Twitter, people have a lot of hate texts and very polarized views, and a lot of the things through research is found that it's all instantaneous. And most people regret saying what they did about 10 minutes later. So it all kind of dwells around that a few minutes when their emotions are very high, when they actually tweet about something which they, as I said, regret very soon. So how do we actually control that space? And he designed a very intuitive product through, as I said, human-centered approach, and it's called Ambient. So it kind of plays it on people's mood and music, and understanding people's mood through an intelligent system, and realizing how do we what kind of music would actually help them calm themselves down, or kind of try and maybe move away from Twitter, even if it is for a few minutes. So it actually was quite experimental in the beginning, but he was able to manage to test some of these as well, and he was able to win a commendation from the RSA for the novelty of the project, and at the same time the way he approached it, in the sense of not necessarily another innovation that adds more problem, but actually trying to address some of these interesting polarizations social media creates through design, but more of a disruptive way of doing it, if you know what I mean. So playing a sound in a way that would distract you from doing the thing that you actually want to do. So disruptive design is actually an interesting approach as well within design. So he's kind of applied it quite nicely within the Bridging the Divide project. And the same brief, another student of mine who also got the commendation award that year, she used gamification. So it's a good example for using theory versus practice here. And she kind of looked at a small neighborhood. So how do we actually make this neighborhood a lot more inclusive? So she used a human-centered approach and applied gamification theory by interacting with each other and within the neighborhood. They get incentives in order to spend it with the local businesses. So in a way, she's building a sense of community by gamifying the process, at the same time rewarding people for helping their local businesses as well, in order to help the local businesses. I think, again, interesting way of addressing polarization through nudge theories and nudge behaviors. So that was, I thought that was worth sharing in terms of how design, again, is used as an inquiry within the space of bringing conversations in sort of especially kind of sensitive topics about polarization. So this was a final year project by a student called Pepper. So she used intersectionality as a theory here, as a framework, and she wanted to design for new mothers. So she came to me and was like, I'm really interested in designing for new mothers and lots of challenges they face. And but after research, she actually came back and said, you know what, there's quite a lot of apps and datas and products being done for new mothers, but there is absolutely no research for new fathers, and there is a big space that's been lost in the area. So she actually started researching, and she found out there is maybe like 1 or 2 products for new fathers. So there's a big gap in the market. So she actually designed for new fathers, and through interviews and kind of creative engagement, like card sorting workshops, this was all pre-pandemic, so it was a lot more easier to get data then. And so she found out that the fathers feel a lot more insecure than the mothers do, because they're constantly neglected, because the focus is mostly on the mother and the baby. So how do you actually design a product in order to bridge that, again, a gap in the market, at the same time using intersectionality in kind of looking at, yes, ultimately you are helping the new mom by designing and including the new fathers into the design. And she developed a very interactive playmat and an app that it's almost like a journal, I suppose. And I think there was also a physical journal where the father would be able to connect with the newborn through a digital journal and through the interactive mat, which has the father's voice recorded, so the baby has more of an interesting interactive connection with the father. How are we doing on time? So I'll just talk about this particular project and maybe open up for questions. So this was a master's project, but was also associated with a research project where Andrea Gomez, so she was a student of mine a couple of years ago. She wanted to understand, how do we communicate natural language processing to multiple stakeholders? And we were working with a startup company called Lumi Assist, who had built AI technology, voice assistant, mostly for kind of business people to manage their workspace, and it used NLP, natural language processing, as a way to actually make more intuitive insights and decisions. So she used co-design and also creative methods like physicalization of some of these workings of the algorithms, and how do we actually use creative ways to visualize these workings through physical products. And that's something that we do day to day, and how do we actually make sense of these. And she built a card tool for these stakeholders to sit around, if they're talking about algorithms, what kind of negotiations they can make. Where do they actually have the focus on, privacy negotiations, or, where do they apply like agencies within these stakeholders, whether it be user, whether it be designer, whether that be a computer scientist, or whether that be a programmer. How does it actually? What are the things that they need to be considering? And and perhaps if you want to talk about legibility, that was one of the main things she was trying to understand how do we communicate the workings of the algorithms, and how do we actually communicate the legibility through to non-experts, but they're still part of the stakeholder mapping, because they do have a say in what some of these technologies do and say. So she used creative methods in order to have these kind of discussions and understand how do you actually have these difficult conversations around the table, what are the best ways to share good practices. And as I said, some of them are a year long, some of them are 4 months long. So I don't necessarily think she was able to see what the recurring effects of these tools were. But the quick feedback from the company was it was quite an interesting tool for them in order to use. But perhaps if we had more time, we would have iterated it, or perhaps even tested it in a more kind of meaningful way. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that was interesting, and I am happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question?
You said this project is based on dialogue tools, and the dialogue is also for the students. Also, is has research. What dialogue tool? What's API? What is technology? Do they research? Technology research.
What kind of technology? That's a very good question. Yeah. Again, this is where when do they stop researching? And they are not technologists, so for them to be researching on how algorithms work has its own limitations, and perhaps we do need that. Hence, she used co-design as an approach, because in a way, co-design is a collaborative space where you're actually each of the stakeholders are taking ownership of the design. So it's not just the designer who's designing, but the stakeholders also saying, okay, this is what we would like to have. So I think there were definitely limitations in her understanding how the algorithms work. That is. But I think there are lots of information and collaborative element behind understanding it came from our industry partners who were actually creating those algorithms.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions online from attendees online? Mark has a question for you.
Be quite pragmatic and on human-computer interaction of my questions. You've been quite successful with master students and publications, and I just wondered if there was any tips that you could give on that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I don't necessarily think successful is the right word, but we do. I mean, computer science, you do have big numbers in computer science. There's no way comparing that. But we are very fortunate in kind of seeing good students, because I teach master students for a year, so you get to know them quite well, and you know that so they are very good in understanding the technological side of the problem, and so in a way I am sort of I'm playing the game to know who's doing, who will be a good person to supervise, if you know what I mean. But at the same, and also it's setting the expectations early as well. In this particular, the last project I was showing, it was a bit of a challenge in the master's students, kind of, because I've been working on this project for almost a couple of years as part of the second postdoc. So I know the literature, I kind of know what the topic is, but for them to understand it and do something meaningful in 4 months was extremely challenging. I think that's, again, as a supervisor, I suppose it's, you keep your expectations low in what could be achieved, but a lot of weight will, at the end of the day, fall on you in writing. Yeah, and I think it's lots of the project, as I said, obviously I've handpicked a few which are very interesting, and you're seeing the space like, oh, I don't think there's any, the HCI publications, and you realize like there's no one actually done anything on this. This is great. So you kind of spot the area halfway through the supervision and try and make sense of it, I suppose, through the publication.
Okay, yeah. Great, thank you.
Is
there another question? Yeah, okay, Antonius. Right.
Hi, thank you so much for the interesting presentation. I understand the transition from design being a solution to becoming a tool for inquiry. For example, we have social networking sites that are providing a solution to communication and social networking and stuff like that, but it can also be a useful tool for researchers that, because they generate all this data that could become useful for researchers as well. I want to ask you, is there anything fundamental in the design process that make it such a good inquiry tool? And then how important is the local contextual factors? For example, when you want to design a new study or a new research and you want to incorporate some design aspects in your methodology, how challenging that process is, and how much is it dependent on how you in the local context of the study that you're designing?
Thank you, Anthony. I think it's a really interesting question. Very, it's a very challenging process because dealing with, I'll say it in two different processes. So dealing with students, they easily jump to the traditional one and they say, oh, I'm going to do an interview, and you've got to try and move them away from that. I'm like, yes, great, but what else can you do with it? What else? How else can you collect data? And so things, especially when this is why the human-centered, user-centered approach really helped us in sort of justifying some of the methods, because like as simple as things like card sorting exercise, I'm sure HCI has lots of papers on card sorting exercises, building user personas. So trying to sort of, again, I don't think they realize they're doing HCI approaches or methods, but making them sort of think beyond the obvious in terms of interviews is challenging, but when they see the results and they make sense of it, it is very rewarding at the end as well. So, but it is a bit challenging with the students still in kind of pushing the boundaries beyond interviews. But when it comes to some of the research projects, we've done some very, very interesting jobs, interesting work in kind of using design as a way of inquiry and design as a way of discourse. So one of the things with your colleague TOTeM, we've hopefully in the next one we will talk more in detail, but we've done some online workshops where we've kind of tried to replicate some of the creative approaches on Miro. Very difficult, but when the lockdown came in, we had to improvise a lot. So we did it quite well, actually, I have to say. Storyboarding, design fiction activities, Edgar de Bono's 6 Thinking Hats. So we've done quite a few of those as a creative way to collect data. And again, your second part of the question is, how do you actually contextualize it? I think that's really important as well. Why do you want to do this? I think rationalization is really, really important in research. So we try and associate some of these activities that we designed. So we designed those activities across like the Mortier's human data interaction framework, like he has the agency, negotiability, and legibility. So we really try to justify, okay, if you're doing this particular card sorting, why are we doing this under agency? Are we able to justify those? So what are the elements in this cards that actually talks about agency? Or if you're saying legibility, we're using, let's do negotiability. Let's say we're using a particular story in order to understand how some of these technological elements are changing through time. How do people negotiate their data privacy online, for example? So does the story actually capture that essence of negotiability in that design fiction story? So we really try and justify a lot of these, break down a lot of these methods. I know for a quantitative researcher, it probably is kind of killing you now. Like, how is any of these making sense? But it does make sense to a qualitative researcher. The sort of narrative that you get helps really to help me to justify some of the aims we had.
Thank you, Arthi. I am a qualitative researcher, by the way, so okay. I totally get it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Any other questions online? Okay, if not, thank you so much, Arti, for your presentation. It was really informative, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And I have to tell you that every time I meet a researcher outside and I say I'm from Brunel, there's two names that come up. It's Mark Perry and yourself.
Really?
So that's exactly why I said that.
Thank you. It was very kind. It was really kind. But thank you so much for the opportunity. I mean, this is a fantastic venue. I mean, any future talks in SIPO, I'm very happy to be part of it, and something I've really missed, to be honest, because everything we do ultimately informs. For me, it informs HCI, so having a space to share, discuss, and continue the discussions is fantastic. Thank you, Mark and Monica, for organising this.
Of course, thank you. Oh, great, you unmuted your mic to hear the clap. I love it. I love it. Okay, so just to tell everyone, first of all, thank you for attending the session. Just for future as well, so the next talk that will be organized, it will be organized within, I'll let you know, 2 or 3 weeks, and I'll let you know who the speaker will be. And overall, the aim for this research group is that there's going to be a talk every 2 to 3 weeks, whether it could be a talk or it could be a workshop. Either way, the aim is for members and people who attend actually to get to learn something and to gain from it. So that's the update for the research group. Thanks again, and thank you everyone. Have a lovely day. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.